Before we begin, 350 Humboldt would like to acknowledge that where we live and hold our meetings in Humboldt County is on the unceded territory and ancestral homelands of Indigenous nations, including the Tolowa, Hoopa, Karuk, Matol, Wailaki, Wiyot, and Yurok. We thank Indigenous nations who have been caretakers of the land, and additionally, we recognize that the well-being of all people is bound up with that of Indigenous peoples, and we must all act on climate. We're very fortunate to have energy researcher Amin Younes here today to discuss local alternatives for reducing emissions from the electricity sector, as well as community perceptions of those alternatives. Amin is a fellow at the Schatz Energy Research Center, where he studies Humboldt's offshore wind resource, options to improve our connection to the statewide grid, and other local energy issues. Amin is an alum of Humboldt State's Energy Technology and Policy Graduate Program, and until recently, Amin served on the Redwood Coast Energy Authority's Community Advisory Committee. So a few logistics. As I said before, you'll be muted throughout the talk. Amin will present for about 30 minutes. There'll be an opportunity to ask Amin questions after 15 minutes and again after 30 minutes. So around 7:15 and around 7:35. You can enter questions in the chat whenever you'd like, and I'll bring them to Amin's attention in roughly the order that they're received. A recording of this talk will be posted on our website, world.350.org/Humboldt, and I'll post that in the chat in a second. While you're on the website, please sign up for 350 Humboldt updates. You'll receive announcements for events and other ways to get involved. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, including the North Coast Environmental Center, 11th Hour, the Climate Action Campaign of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Cooperation Humboldt, and Zero Waste Humboldt. I also want to thank Pat Carr and Haley Connors-Keith of 350 Humboldt for all their work to organize and promote this event. And lastly, of course, I want to extend a hearty thanks to our speaker. Amin, thank you so much for being here with us today. And with that, I'll turn things over to you.
All right, great. Thank you for the introduction there, and thanks everybody for inviting me and for being here today. Hopefully you can see that. So that's the second slide. So yeah, I'll just launch into it, and then as Katie said, there will be a break partway through. Sorry, I'm gonna get my Zoom set up here. There'll be a break partway through to ask questions, and then a Q&A at the end. I think you can just submit those into the chat. All right, so without further ado, today I'm talking about exploring energy futures in Humboldt County consistent with the goals of California's Renewable Portfolio Standard. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, we will cover it in due time. So today I'm going to start with the motivation for this research and this presentation, which was to understand the technically and socially feasible ways to develop renewable electricity in Humboldt County. I'll briefly touch on the methods I used, though not at too much length. I used a mix of interviews with local residents and a technical and economic assessment of energy possibilities. And then I'll talk about my qualitative results from the interviews. We'll pause for a Q&A, and then I'll move on to the quantitative results and conclusions. There's quite a lot of quantitative results, so that'll take some time to get through. So what's the motivation here? Why do we want to develop renewables in Humboldt County? And why am I using the Renewable Portfolio Standard as a guideline? So the Renewable Portfolio Standard is a very important piece of legislation that takes some steps towards addressing climate change, and it sort of is a part of that legislation that focuses on the electricity grid. It mandates that California's electricity grid be at least 60% renewable by 2030 and be 100% clean or renewable by 2045. In this context, renewable includes things like wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, and small hydro. And clean is large hydro and nuclear. Not that there will be any more large hydro or probably any nuclear in 2045. And Humboldt really, I think, needs to participate in achieving these goals from a couple of perspectives. First, there's this kind of unequivocally a technical need to develop local energy. As I'll talk about in a bit, Humboldt is, well, it's, as they say, behind the redwood curtain. Humboldt has a relatively isolated electrical grid, and it can't simply import all the electricity it uses, as a place like where I live, San Francisco, likely does. It actually needs to generate renewables locally, and it needs to generate electricity locally, and those will eventually need to be renewables. But from a different perspective, there's a field called the study of distributive justice, and the idea is that every person more or less should be contributing and should be receiving the benefits associated with energy development. So energy development comes at a cost, but it comes with benefits like cleaner air and job opportunities, and it makes ethical sense for Humboldt County to be a part of that. And I'll touch more on that subject a little bit later too. So as I said, I used mixed methods. I used a mix of qualitative interviews and quantitative analysis. And the reason I did that was in the wake of the onshore wind project that is depicted here. And it was clear from the discussions happening around that project that the project was technically and economically feasible, but it was not socially possible because people just did not want it for a variety of legitimate reasons. And whichever side of that project you come down on, I think there were certainly some legitimate concerns, whether or not you particularly thought it should have happened or not. So it made sense to talk to people and understand those concerns a little bit better. And interviews is a great way to do that, is to uncover the types of questions I didn't necessarily know to ask or to ask in a survey. And above and beyond that, the literature on the subject of infrastructure development suggests that having two-way communication between developers and residents, which was one of the notable shortcomings of this project, is critical for project success. And by talking to people and having that back and forth dialogue myself, I was able to learn a little bit about what that process could be like. So the qualitative methods that I talked about included interviewing 10 Humboldt County residents, and they were not chosen at random, but they were people who were active in energy discussions locally. And I tried to find people who represented a broad set of views and a broad set of demographics to the best of my ability. I asked very open-ended questions to really try to understand as broadly as I could anything that they thought about, anything that they cared about relating to local energy, focusing on electricity. And I had, for each person, I actually had 2 discussions, and in between the discussions, I did the quantitative analyses that I'll talk about a little later in this discussion, or in this presentation rather. And I shared those results with people, and I tried to have that kind of two-way communication that I discussed earlier. In addition to that, some of the data I discuss is from articles and op-eds relating to the proposed TerraGen onshore wind project. So I actually only touched very briefly on the qualitative results. I focus mostly on the quantitative results. And this is a little bit of a preview, though, of the qualitative results, trying to depict them visually. So one of the things, and I've shown these in kind of large speech bubbles, things that I heard a lot were that developing renewable electricity is very important to locals, to Humboldt County residents, as a way to mitigate climate change, as well as to address other ecosystem harms. For example, pollution that's associated with many fossil fuels. On the kind of a different angle, another thing that people really cared about is who is benefiting, who would be harmed by projects, and who makes the decisions. So the first 2 of those, who benefits and who harmed, are kind of aspects of what I talked about previously, distributive justice, and who makes the decisions is what's called procedural justice. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later. And then the third, I think, noteworthy, or the third most noteworthy area of significant overlap among the people I talked to is that beyond, climate change, job creation was the second most important thing to the people I talked to, and people were most concerned with kind of well-paying, good jobs that would last a long time, not simply a short-term construction boom. And then kind of on the bottom left here, in a little smaller text, I've shown some of the areas of disagreements. So some people I talked to felt that we should prioritize offshore wind. Some thought that biomass was the best resource we have locally in Humboldt County. Some kind of supported the belief that biomass is not a zero emissions renewable energy source, and that the emissions are a big problem. And then kind of on the other side, some were really focused on distributed solar because it has the least ecosystem harms. It can be built in areas that are already disturbed, whereas some of the other technologies would not be. So the biggest split that I noted when talking to people was kind of two groups of people. One who supported a big centralized energy future, and one who supported a kind of a hidden, unobtrusive energy future where energy was distributed on rooftops, and as I said, no additional land needed to be converted to energy. And I'll kind of highlight these two perspectives by two quotes from people I talked to. The first person said they're a huge fan of distributed energy for a whole bunch of reasons. It can be produced where impacts have already occurred. You don't rely on transmission of energy over long distances, which can waste energy and result in hazards to habitats, wildfires, and so on. And on the other side is the kind of vision of the future of Humboldt County as the Silicon Valley of wind energy. I've also heard it as the Cape Canaveral of wind energy. So people who picture Humboldt Port having wind turbines built that are then launched up and down the California coast and perhaps even into Oregon. So two very different ideas about what the future could hold. And this, I think, already made it clear the need for discussions and for people to come together and kind of bring their beliefs together. And it also, as I've talked about, there were some disagreements about kind of the facts on the ground about these different technologies. And it set the stage for some quantitative analyses to help shed some light onto that. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, I'll dive a little bit into the quantitative methods that I employed, and then we'll have a quick Q&A before the quantitative results. So at the left here is a very simple model of Humboldt County's electrical grid in the octagon there. And Humboldt County's electrical grid, as I said, is very isolated. It's connected to the larger California grid by some relatively small transmission lines with a capacity of about 70 megawatts. For context, the local load averages closer to 110 megawatts, and the peaks are as high as, say, 160 or 170 megawatts. So it's clear that we can't simply import all our energy without investing a tremendous amount of money in transmission lines. So we do have to rely somewhat on these local generators, and those include a couple of biomass plants on the left here, Fairhaven and Scotia. Since kind of doing this analysis, it looks like Fairhaven is a little unlikely to continue operation, but it is in this analysis. It was current at the time of the analysis. Baker Station Hydro is a small run-of-river hydro plant. HBGS stands for Humboldt Bay Generating Station. It's a relatively large natural gas plant. And there is a sizable amount of local solar at present and plans to build more. There's a small amount of local storage at present. And I'm actually not offhand aware whether there are plans to build more, but I think they are. I think there are. And I looked at 5 different scenarios with additional local renewables built. I looked at various combinations or various levels of offshore wind, utility scale solar, distributed scale solar, which is rooftop solar, and biomass. And I built scenarios as I'll describe in a second. And then for each of these renewable energy generation scenarios, I calculated their cost, their land use, the associated job growth, and the greenhouse gas emissions. So in order to develop each scenario, I had to come up with a target for how much renewable energy should Humboldt County be generating. And for my analysis, I chose the year 2030. I think there are a lot of interesting and justifiable years to look at, but 2030 is not too far in the future that I think it's really interesting to think about. It was about a year further in the future was when I started this research. Now it's only 9 years off. And in 2030, the renewable portfolio standard requires 60% of utility scale generation to be from qualifying renewables. In this chart on the right, you see that actually we're going past 60%. And the reason for that is that distributed solar, so rooftop solar again, is not counted in that total. And when you include the projected levels of distributed solar across the state, I calculated that the statewide level will be closer to 66%. So when I did my analysis, I created these scenarios in which 66% of Humboldt's electricity use is from locally generated renewables. And that could, in my calculations, include distributed solar, utility scale renewables, or yeah, I guess that's the two types of renewables. So I think this is where I put my Q&A break. So I suppose I'll keep sharing. But if we have any questions, we can take a few minutes to address them right now.
So we do have one question from Robert. So Robert's interested in learning more about your strategy in selecting interviewees.
Oh, that's a great question. So let's see, I was trying to, as I said, reach a broad swath of people. So I reached out to kind of local government organizations, local tribal organizations, I guess local tribal governments is what I mean to say there, as well as I reached out to some people who'd written op-eds in the newspaper. And I really just reached out to about 20 or 30 people who I'd heard talk about energy or who were part of an organization that I knew was involved in the local energy conversations. And I emailed them. I used what's called snowball sampling to a medium extent, which is when I interviewed people. At the end of the interview, I'd ask if they had any recommendations for who I might talk to, which is interesting because oftentimes I think you find that they'll point you in the direction of someone who really agrees with them. So if you do that too much, I think you can end up talking to not a very diverse group of people, but only people who think one thing. But sometimes people would say, I really disagree with this person, and then I would go and try to talk to that person. And I won't give any names or names of organizations to protect the anonymity of the folks I talk to.
Great, thanks. That looks like all the questions.
Okay.
So yeah.
Great. Plenty of time. So I'll take my time with the second half here. Okay, so I'm going to start by describing the 5 scenarios that I mentioned earlier. The first is essentially meeting that 66% with the baseline renewables, so what we have in the county, plus the kind of projected growth rates of behind the meter and rooftop solar and the small amount of projects that RCEA has contracted at present, and then adding distributed solar to that. So that requires 300 megawatts of distributed scale solar, and it would require a lot of battery storage in order to make that solar supply curve, which has this daily rounded shape, make that meet the demand curve. So 410 megawatt hours of distributed battery storage. In principle, so that storage could be in houses and in government buildings and schools, whatnot, and it would enable some number of resilient microgrids. It could also, in principle, be electric vehicles with two-way chargers. So this is a pretty new technology that allows electric cars to not only charge from the grid, but to discharge energy into the grid. And I analyzed it as if these batteries were going to be paid for separately, but in principle, some costs could be saved by using vehicles with two-way charging. So the second scenario I looked at was solar, but utility scale. So that's again using the same business as usual resources and an additional 240 megawatts of utility scale solar. The reason that this is a little bit less solar than the distributed scale is that utility scale solar is often tracking. It tracks the sun in one direction, and that allows each megawatt of solar to generate a few more megawatt hours of energy. And that also requires a little bit less utility scale battery storage than the distributed version. Because they're tracking the sun, you actually end up with a little bit more energy in the morning and a little bit more energy in the evening, and that means you need a little bit less battery storage to get through your day. So that's, once again, that's 240 megawatts of utility scale solar. And if we also said that this is kind of for the people who don't like biomass. If we wanted to remove the local biomass, instead of 240 megawatts, we would need 410 megawatts of utility scale solar and quite a lot more batteries. 720 megawatt hours is about twice what the previous slide showed. And we'll get to the bottom line or the cost of this a little bit later. It's a lot more solar and storage because that biomass provides a very useful base load. And as you get high levels of solar penetration, you start needing a lot of storage. Alternatively, instead of solar, if we went with offshore wind, a relatively small 144 megawatt offshore wind project could meet could hit that 66% local renewable target. That's very small compared to the capability of the nearby offshore wind areas, which could generate at least 2 gigawatts. And because the generation profile of offshore wind, though intermittent, doesn't have that strong diurnal profile, you could hit 66% with essentially no storage. And then finally, for the people who do like biomass, we could basically a little more than double the local biomass capability, somewhere between double and triple, add 65 more megawatts of biomass power, and that can function as a base load and would, again, not require any battery storage to hit that 66% target. So I hope I can explain this slide clearly. This is where things start to get perhaps conceptually a little bit complicated. So I have the 5 scenarios on the right plus the business as usual scenario. And I'm showing here essentially how much renewable energy is used locally in each of these scenarios, and then how much is exported, curtailed, and lost. Exported simply means energy that we don't use locally, but we export it on the transmission lines. Curtailed is energy that we can't use locally, and the transmission lines, when that electricity is generated, are fully used, so that energy can't be used. It can't be used to charge batteries, and it just ends up being kind of wasted. And then losses come from charging and discharging the batteries. Since they don't have perfect efficiency, some amount of energy is lost with each charge and discharge cycle. So Humboldt County's present electricity use is a little less than 900 gigawatt hours a year. It's closer to 850, shown in the scale on the left here. But in 2030, projections, I can talk a little bit more if someone asks me to later about the demand projections. But anyway, in 2030, they're projected to be closer to 900 gigawatt hours a year. So in the business as usual scenario with very little growth in renewables, half of the electricity used locally would be renewable, but a significant amount of that, shown in the green here, comes from imports. So we're only generating, closer to a quarter of the energy used locally would be locally generated renewables, and a little bit less than a quarter would be imported renewables. Conversely, kind of all the remaining cases increase that locally used local renewables to 66%, which was again the analysis target. And the 3 solar cases look pretty similar. Some of the electricity is generated at a time that it can't be used locally and has to be exported. A little bit is curtailed and a little bit is lost. With the Sol 410U case shown here, kind of middle right, that's the case with no biomass, where the biomass plants would be shut down. And that results in a little bit more losses, a little bit more curtailments, because the batteries are doing more of the work. And then I think things, again, start to get a little more interesting with the offshore wind scenario. The offshore wind at 144 megawatts, again, a pretty modest scale, generates almost the same amount of electricity that's used locally. But because the time of generation wouldn't perfectly match up with the time of energy being used locally, a significant amount of that electricity would be exported. And then in the biomass case, things are quite different. Biomass is essentially a baseload power. It can generate pretty flat over the course of the day and can almost always be used to meet local supply with very minimal exports. So switching gears here to talk about land use. the distributed solar scenario is 300 megawatts, as I've said, and there's an additional about 30 megawatts, I think, that's the business as usual. And all of that together would take about 90% of Humboldt's usable roof space. This analysis is reasonably rough. They come from kind of per capita estimates of the roof space associated with an average person in a city. So there's certainly some room for error. And it could be that there's not quite enough room. It could be that there's a little bit of extra room. If there isn't quite enough room, though, it is possible also to build these distributed solar arrays on things like parking lots, or on top of garages or other buildings, or simply on the ground, as they were done at the Blue Lake Ranch area's microgrid. So it seems like there's a reasonable amount of space to build this level of distributed solar. Looking at the utility scale solar scenarios, I'm showing here, though I certainly wouldn't suggest this is where we would build solar. This is what 240 megawatts of utility scale solar would look like. It's 1,900 acres. That's the smaller utility scale solar scenario where we keep the existing biomass. In the case that we remove the existing biomass, as I've said, we need a little bit more, or quite a bit more, utility scale solar, and that would take closer to 3,000 acres, which is not shown visually. If this were to be built in agricultural land, it would cause the conversion rate, the rate that in Humboldt County land is being converted away from agricultural use, it would cause that rate to double over a 10-year period. Offshore wind, I'm going to try to speed things up here a little bit because I'm quite a bit behind time now, but I think we do have plenty of time in the end. 144 megawatts takes up 14 square miles, 9,000 acres, quite a bit more than the solar, but of course this is open ocean, and it certainly would provide a hindrance to, say, people interested in fishing, but it's a little bit, that land is a little bit easier to come by, I think. Thinking about the amount of biomass fuel required in this scenario, so including both the existing biomass and the new 65 megawatts of biomass would require a fairly substantial number of dry tons of biomass per year, 625,000. That's estimated at about half the forest residues that Humboldt County can produce. So that's not clear-cutting forest, but that's thinning and activities like that could be done to help manage forest fires regardless, but yeah. So moving on again to talk quickly about job growth. On the left are the construction jobs, on the right are the permanent jobs, and we have, again, the different development scenarios across the bottom. And then in these error bars in black show the margin of error around the estimates that I used. They're quite substantial room for error here. So what we can say, though, is that solar is associated with certainly the most construction jobs, and they're somewhat equal, although distributed scale solar does tend to have quite a bit more jobs. And then again, in the permanent jobs, it's quite a large number of permanent jobs. In the hundreds, 300 to 600 for the distributed and utility scale solar, though again, pretty big error bars around that. Offshore wind is associated with both the fewest construction jobs, or very close to the fewest, and by far the fewest midpoint estimate for ongoing jobs. And biomass is a pretty sizable number of ongoing jobs. I think a lot of that is associated with that forest management kind of tasks that I just mentioned. Okay, so I think we have a couple of kind of beefy concepts here that I'm going to try to walk us through. And then talk about the results associated with those. So in order to make economic comparisons of these different options, we have to kind of equalize a spending today or tomorrow to build a plant, so capital expenditure to buy a plant, with the operational cost that occurs every year, the fuel cost of every year of refueling that, of providing that natural gas or that biomass. And those could be combined using what's called a discount rate. A discount rate describes, and I'm sure some people already know this, so I apologize if I'm explaining something you already know, but hopefully some people find it helpful. So a discount rate describes the rate of time preference. So if we ask the question, would you rather incur a cost of $100 today or $110 in a year? And if for a person those two expenditures are exactly equivalent, that person has what's called a 10% discount rate. which means that each year they're discounting an expenditure in a future year by 10%. And generally, people or organizations with a high discount rate are more interested in incurring future costs and less interested in spending money now to save money in the future. So they might be less interested in buying a more expensive but more fuel efficient vehicle versus someone with a low discount rate would be very interested in buying a more expensive and fuel efficient vehicle. Someone with a higher discount rate would be less interested in buying a more expensive fuel efficient vehicle. In industry, we see discount rates of the range of about 5 to 8%. And I think there's a pretty strong ethical argument that when we're making these types of infrastructure decisions, we should consider discount rates as low as 0%. 0% discount rate, of course, means that spending $100 today is the same as spending $100 in a year, in my estimation. And we can also, if people are interested, I can get a little bit more into the economics. But the kind of fundamental assumption there is that me paying $100 is the same as my great-grandkids paying $100. And that's after inflation, so don't worry about the fact that inflation kind of messes that up. Anyway, hopefully that wasn't too dry. But now that we know what discount rate is, or if we already knew it, then great. We can calculate the levelized cost of local electricity. So that's the average dollars spent per megawatt of hour used, per megawatt hour of electricity used locally. And that is a function of discount rate. So I'll start you off right in the middle here at 5% discount rate. And at a 5% discount rate, the business as usual is the cheapest. In fact, at all discount rates, business as usual delivers a megawatt hour of electricity at about $55. The next cheapest is generally the two different utility scale solar scenarios, and then the offshore wind, followed by the biomass, followed by the distributed scale solar. And at a 5% discount rate, building a huge amount of distributed scale solar with distributed storage would approximately double the cost of local electricity, which is quite substantial, but certainly could be worth it. And we'll even have a little more talk about that in a few minutes. But if we move down to this 0% discount rate end of the chart, we find that these options are now a little bit more palatable. Distributed scale solar is no longer twice what we're doing now. It's maybe more like 50% or 60% above it. And utility scale solar is actually pretty much the same price. So for people who are really focused, I guess as I would say, though some might disagree with this, but for people who really care about the lives that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so forth have, for Humboldt County to build utility scale solar and storage in the 2030 timeframe makes a lot of economic sense. And this is before talking about the cost of carbon emissions. So as probably everyone here knows, emitting carbon into the atmosphere causes damages. We can think of these as economic damages. So the reduction in GDP, that's kind of in my mind, is the inhumane way to think about it. The humane way to think about it is perhaps to think about the loss of life due to wildfires and flooding, and diseases that are going to spread that would otherwise not have spread. And kind of, again, being inhumane, we have then put a dollar value on those lives and talk about the amount of damage done. And that again requires a discount rate because we have to decide how much is this $100 now worth relative to $100 100 years from now. And it also requires understanding the climate sensitivity. So for a given amount of CO2 emissions, how much does the temperature of the Earth rise? And there are widely varying estimates of both of these parameters that lead to pretty varied estimates of this social cost of carbon. I think the lowest estimate I've seen is $10 per ton of CO2. Perhaps the Trump administration's estimate was lower than that, though I'm not sure. And estimates go at least to $1,000 per metric ton, perhaps even more. In fact, for sure, even more. I've seen higher ones, but 1,000 is pretty high in most people's estimation. Okay, so to talk about the cost of carbon emissions, I quantified the emissions from Humboldt County's electricity grid. Just the electricity sector, doesn't include other vehicles, gasoline vehicles or natural gas or anything like that. And I also counted imports into Humboldt County's electrical grid, and I counted exports. So if we export renewables, that helps decarbonize California's grid. It reduces carbon emissions across the state. And I quantified the amount of emissions and looked at how many dollars of damage that would do. And the vast majority of that comes from that 34%. So 66% is renewable, but 34% remains non-renewable. That's in this model, it's mostly natural gas, and that has some appreciable carbon emissions associated with it. And so here are those amount of emissions in each scenario. And I think we're again okay on time, but I'll try to wrap this up in the next 4 or 5 minutes. The business as usual case has the most annual emissions, 218,000 metric tons of CO2 per year. The remaining cases are all relatively close, and I guess we can put an asterisk around biomass that I'll get to in a second. Offshore wind is substantially lower, and that comes from these exports. So all these exported renewables are helping decarbonize the California grid, and that reduces the total amount of CO2 emitted in the state. Now, biomass here relies on an estimate of biomass being approximately carbon neutral. That depends on a lot of factors, like many of these other contentious topics. If you're welcome to not agree with that, and if you disagree with that, then you should kind of ignore the numbers that I present for biomass on the next slide. So using the California cap and trade market price, which is about pretty close to $20 a ton of CO2, we see that Humboldt County's electrical grid in the baseline case is doing about $4 million of damages a year, or is incurring $4 million worth of future damages, is another way to say that. And in the lowest case, offshore wind, those are reduced by, $1.7 million down to $2.7 million. Using a more moderate cost of carbon, this is proposed by the Biden administration, $50 a ton, 2.5 times higher. And that results in estimates between $6.7 and $11 million a year. And then finally, a little bit of a higher estimate. This is the cost of carbon that Sweden uses. It results in an estimate, I can't do the math off the top of my head, maybe $13 million difference between the offshore wind case and the business as usual case. I think that's right. Maybe it's 12. Anyway, pretty substantial annual damages in this, especially in this highest estimate. These ongoing costs, or these damages are on the same order of magnitude as the ongoing costs, O&M and fueling costs associated with the electrical grid. And we can go back to that previous plot showing the cost of electricity with these damages included. And I'm gonna take a second here because now I've made this into an eye chart. But what I'm doing is I'm showing the previous chart kind of in a lighter color. So this light gray is the old value and the dark black is now the new value. So in the business as usual scenario, we went from $55 per megawatt hour up to $90 a megawatt hour with the $140 a ton cost of carbon. And everything moves up, but business as usual, because it has the most emissions, it moves up the most. Offshore wind moves up the least. And what you start to see is that the solar cases, the utility solar in particular, are starting to be appreciably lower than business as usual. And even with discount rates as high as 3%, they're about the same. What this is telling us is that if we include this social cost of carbon, it makes very good economical sense to build local utility scale solar. And we can also see that offshore wind now has kind of reached cost parity at this low discount rate. And I think in the interest of time, I will speak to this slide very quickly. 66% was our target. If we want to go higher, it starts to get harder and harder to make this solar generation curve down here match up with demand, and you start to need more and more and more more and more storage to go along with the solar. We saw a little bit of a preview of that with removal of biomass. And the same is really ultimately true of offshore wind. 66% didn't require any storage, but if you wanted to get as high as say 90 or 100%, you'd start to need a lot of storage. Alternatively, a valuable strategy is to mix and match resources. So in this example here, you can see that with a mix of solar and offshore wind, there's a nice period where offshore wind stops generating, where solar is generating very well, and vice versa. and that these two resources can complement each other. Now, it's not the case that that one is always generating, so we would need some storage or some other resources to get us through some of these periods, but the two do have synergy. And we'll just briefly go through the conclusions. We have a lot of resources available to us: biomass, utility scale solar, rooftop solar, offshore wind, and views are very different about which developments are the best and what Humboldt County should do. But I think a core value of the folks that I talked to was these concepts of distributive and procedural justice. So caring about who benefits, who's harmed, and how decisions are made. And successful proposals in the future really, I think, need to take this into account so they don't fall into the same pitfalls as the proposed onshore wind project. They have to have a more open and transparent process and a more open accounting of who's bearing kind of the burdens of these projects. And lastly, I think it's really important to create an environment where discussions can start happening as soon as possible, so that it's not only happening around a particular project, but they're constantly happening. And I'm very happy to say that I think what we're doing here really qualifies as it's a good example of what I'm suggesting we do. We're doing it right now. So that's great. And that's now the end of my presentation. So I will take a long drink of water.
Thank you, Amin. That was great. So we do have a bunch of questions. So the first is from Bob. And Bob writes, I don't understand why Humboldt keeps trying to build large projects when there's always some group to say no. We're running out of time. Why not put solar on existing homes so we don't need permits and transmission improvements?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly good approach. I mean, that's, sorry, I'm flipping through here. That's essentially what this is. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach. I think one of the key challenges around that is funding those projects. Probably homeowners don't necessarily all have the funding to pay for rooftop solar. And I've heard a little bit through actually being on the CAC, the Community Advisory Committee at RCEA, that Redwood Coast Energy Authority is interested in helping kind of make that happen by providing low interest loans to people who want to add distributed solar. So yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's a great approach. And I think that if you want that to happen, you should, I don't know, talk to RCEA and tell them you support that idea.
Thanks. So the next question comes from Sina. So Sina writes, where do the costs come in for developing resources? So this was a question I think maybe asked before the part of the presentation that was specifically about costs, but specifically, like, who pays for the cost of maintenance or repair or replacement of renewable energy infrastructure?
Yeah, so in general, I think with basically the exception of the distributed solar scenario, these would be built by a developer, and they could be built in a public way. So they could be built, forgetting the term now, but community funded projects. And if they're community funded projects, then the maintenance costs would be covered by the community. They would, they're going to have revenue associated with them. So some of that revenue would go to maintenance costs. And something like a bond would be needed to foot the upfront cost. They could also be built the way the TerraGen project was proposed, which is by a private developer who is interested in building and paying for the land and building the turbines, and then they would pay the operations and maintenance costs, and they would then sell the electricity. So I think those are the two ways. If it were distributed solar, then it's homeowners paying maintenance costs.
So Sina has another question about the potential for sea level rise to take out some of the buildings in lower lying areas and reduce the the capacity for rooftop solar. She's wondering if that's something that you've looked at.
It's not something I've looked at. I think making sure that the infrastructure we're building is climate resilient is super important. And my understanding is that things like the proposed build-outs to the Humboldt harbor in order to support offshore wind are being done in a way that takes into account sea level rise. Not super aware of exactly what's going on, but I think it is kind of safe to assume that if people are displaced, they'll still need housing, and perhaps there are certain buildings that that would not be wise to invest in rooftop solar on, but I expect that the amount of housing in Humboldt County is not going to be reduced. And I've also heard rumors of a very aggressive real estate market due to people being more interested in moving to Humboldt County and working remotely. So it's possible that there would in fact be even more housing locally, although that would come with more people, which means more electricity use. So it's a hard one to answer.
So we have another question from Carolyn. Carolyn wants to know approximately how many offshore wind turbines would be needed to generate 144 megawatts.
Yeah, so that's modeled as 12 megawatt turbines. It could also be like 10, 15 megawatt turbines, but they're huge turbines.
All right, so John is puzzled by the low levelized cost of offshore wind. He says the Schatz report shows offshore wind costs being much higher.
Yes, so there are possibly multiple things going on. I think one is that the Schatz report includes, if I remember, no, I was going to say it includes the cost of port infrastructure upgrades, but it doesn't. It includes that in the job estimates, not the cost estimates, I think. The big difference, though, is that this offshore wind cost is not the cost of offshore wind, but it's the cost of all the electricity on the grid, assuming 66% is offshore wind. So there's still some natural gas rolled up in there and some other cheaper resources. And I think that's why my costs end up lower. I also don't use exactly the same resources, but I think the big driver there is that I'm not showing the cost of just the wind energy, but the total cost across the grid with a high level of wind development.
Okay, thank you, Amin. So Robert writes, what is your opinion of the vertical axis wind turbines in cost and efficiency?
I know virtually nothing about them. Yes, I think my understanding is that the horizontal axis ones are kind of the state of the art in terms of being cost effective. But yes, it's well outside of my area of expertise.
All right. So Pat is interested in learning more about the sources of carbon emissions from the non-business as usual, more renewable options. So is that source of carbon emissions from manufacturing of solar panels, for example?
Yeah, so yes, okay. I thought for a second there they were talking about the like literature source, but where the emissions are coming from, most of it, as I said, in all the cases is from the natural gas plant. But then there are some associated emissions in both the wind and the solar associated with construction of the infrastructure, like life cycle emissions, as well as in the biomass case. So all those infrastructures have some amount of emissions being accounted.
So we have another question about biomass. So Dan writes, did you look at were you assuming that biomass generation included efficient power generation, such as like gasification or some other technology, or were you assuming like raw biomass incineration?
Yeah, so it's I have to look at my resource. It's quite a bit more efficient. I was just looking the other day at the Humboldt sawmill and I think the Fairhaven heat rates, and the model I use is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Their model is much more efficient. I don't think they're thermal gasification, but they'd be more like a a more state-of-the-art raw biomass combustion. I can probably dig that up.
So I have a question, actually. I was wondering if in your projections for forecasted electricity use in Humboldt County, were you including increases due to increased electrification and transportation and buildings?
Yes, so I did not. It's kind of the short answer. There's a small amount of increase. So the numbers I used are from Redwood Coast Energy Authority's Integrated Resource Plan from a couple of years ago, and that includes some year-over-year growth in demand. It ends up being it's about 6% higher than present levels, so relatively small year-over-year growth. And they include data for some electrification scenarios, which I took a look at, but I did not end up using because my thesis was already really long and I didn't want to do any more to make it longer. A slightly more helpful answer, though, is that I think some of the work the Schatz Energy Research Center is doing right now related to offshore wind does take a look at those estimates. Actually, I know it takes a look at those estimates. I don't know what's going to end up being published in the reports, but that will be looked at. And there's certainly potential for kind of some synergies between that electrical load growth and the electrical generation. So maybe at first glance, it seems like if we have higher load, it's going to be more expensive to meet that load, which is partially true. But if those loads are electrified and they're demand responsive, they're flexible loads. So EV chargers where the charger can be programmed to receive a signal that tells it not to charge right now, but charge in a couple hours when we have, when the sun comes back out or the wind's blowing again. Then you can end up needing less storage. So yeah, I guess that's kind of way longer than the question you actually asked. But yeah, so I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. So we have more questions, which is great. Thank you so much, Amin, again for fielding all these rapid fire questions. We really appreciate it. Sure. So Diane wants to know if the levelized cost that you calculated includes the cost of fuel and maintenance over time.
Yes, it does. So there's an annual fuel cost and there's maintenance cost. It doesn't include decommissioning costs, I don't think. And it does include, it's over, shoot, I did this a while ago. I can't remember all the exact numbers. I think I did the analysis over a 20-year time horizon. And since storage doesn't last that long, it does actually include a storage replacement partway through that. So the storage costs end up being very significant as a result of that, because you have to buy it once and then buy it again later.
It looks like that's all of our questions.
There's a question about what's likely in 2030.
Oh gosh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I've gotten that question before, and the answer is I have absolutely no idea. But I can hopefully say something helpful, which is that I think offshore wind is definitely possible. One interesting thing about offshore wind is that Humboldt County has not only a great offshore wind resource, one of the best in the country, it has the best port for deploying offshore wind in the whole state. So it's very likely that, or it's at least highly possible or highly plausible that anyone who's interested in developing offshore wind anywhere kind of along the West Coast would do a pilot scale project at Humboldt County. And that would be that 144 megawatt scenario. It's also possible that offshore wind ends up being developed at a much larger scale, multiple gigawatts, in which case sort of the same thing would apply. Interestingly, that we wouldn't be able to use that much more of the electricity locally. What would happen if electricity were developed at that scale is that there would be tremendous transmission lines, and this 70 megawatt transmission limit that I've been talking about and was important in my results would end up not not mattering anymore. I personally doubt that utility scale solar would ever be built in the county in significant amounts, because I think developers would prefer to build it in the desert where they're going to get more energy. Even though we can't end up physically importing those electrons into Humboldt County because of the transmission, it's going to, I think, look like a better investment. And distributed scale is certainly possible, though I think it would be a really big challenge to, there's a lot that would have to happen. Certainly not a permitting process, but a lot would have to happen to move that much distributed solar into the county. It would require training up or bringing in a lot of people to work on those installations, and it would require finding a lot of money or lending a lot of money to homeowners. So I think offshore wind is the most likely scenario, but who knows? And I think biomass would get too much pushback.
All right. So we have a question from Robert, but I think we'll just put you in touch with Amin.
Sure. That sounds good.
Great. Well, if that's everything, looks like no last minute questions that I missed. I guess we can wrap up. Thanks again to Amin, our co-sponsors, and thanks to all of you for being with us on this Monday evening. Again, you can find a recording on our website, and I am going to drop that in the chat right now, as well as our email address. So if you would like to contact 350 Humboldt and reach out and ask us any questions or sign up for updates, please do. We'd love for you to join us. Yeah, thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.